Hi, thank you. I'm very glad to be here. Nikhil J. Alva. He has been chasing a left field, harebrained idea since probably the time he understood what an idea is. But what sets him apart is that he has complete immersion, dedication, and pig-headedness to getting that idea off the ground that 9 times out of 10, luck favors him, and it actually comes to fruition. He is a self-confessed serial entrepreneur. His name is synonymous with reality television and non-fiction television in India. He has launched and discovered and launched people like Ayushmann Khurrana, Rang Vijay, Monica Shergill, who heads Netflix, yours truly, Koël Purie. He was my first boss. My first paycheck had his name signed on it. He's a natural storyteller, so it comes as no surprise that If I Have to Be a Soldier is out now. What did surprise me is how pacey, racy, saucy, and full of Bollywood masala it is, and also how full of gore, violence, bloodshed. It is almost like Ludlam-esque. And we're going to get really into the nitty-gritties of this book, which is set in the northeast troubled areas of Mizo Hills in the 1960s. We will talk about that, but first, let's launch the book. Nikhil, please.
Introduce Mukund Padmanabhan. Mukund Padmanabhan is a professor at Kriya University where he teaches philosophy and related subjects. Earlier, he was the editor of The Hindu. He was appointed to the post in 2016 after having been the editor of the Business Daily, the Hindu business line, a sister publication from the same group. The Great Flap of 1942 is his first book. Over to Koël.
Please, will you launch the book to begin with? Let's do it.
A big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, just a couple of lines saying thank you very much for having me here to do this. I think it's extraordinary. The subject you've chosen, it's not something that a lot of mainstream writers get to write about. So I think it's really brave and interesting foray into fiction. Many congratulations, and I wish the book all the best. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Nikhil, I promise I won't bite. You can sit next to me, okay? As I said, this book is set in the troubled times of 1960s Northeast. So my very first question to you is, why the Northeast? Did the story find you, or did you go chasing it?
Everyone I've spoken to about the novel, from the first time I had the ideas, asked me the same question: why the hell, the Northeast? Well, I think growing up in the 70s, my mother traveled a lot in the Northeast because of her political work, and she'd take a lot of us children with her on some of these trips. So I've been exposed to the Northeast from childhood. Loved the area, the space, have a lot of friends from the Northeast. And there were stories and things that fascinated me about the Northeast. One of the stories that really got me very early is this whole idea of a particular bamboo species that flowers once every 48 years, right? And when it flowers, it triggers a plague of rats. And that actually, then leads to an insurgency. That causality I found really intriguing and fascinating. And at the back of my mind, I knew I wanted to do something with it as a story. I wasn't quite sure what form it would take, but it's been there for many, many years.
Now, I wasn't planning to do it just off the top of the head, but now that you've talked about the rats, this is a bit in the book. His book is very graphic. It's very beautifully descriptive. You're kind of living there in some moments. It's heart-wrenching. In others, it churns your stomach inside out. These are all good things. They're not bad things. Now that you've talked about these rats, I just want to read this one section that, minus my glasses, okay, that is, you'll just get an idea of what it felt like. And I think this was your seed for the book, right? The rats were mostly no, not that bit. A female rat can bear up to 12 pups in a single litter. A month later, it can be pregnant again. Besides, rats become fertile when they are just 3 months old. So if the male rat doesn't eat its young, a pair of rats can account to over 14,000 pups every year. When the Motam, am I pronouncing it right? Motam came to the Mizo Hills in 1959, the males stopped cannibalizing their young. I'm just going to read that line again because this really got me. The males stopped cannibalizing their young, preferring instead the bamboo fruit and its protein-rich seed that they lay scattered in abundance across the land. When all the seeds had been eaten, the rats invaded the fields, chomping and gnawing their way through the standing crops. When the crops were gone, they turned their attention to the homes and granaries in the villages and hamlets across the Mizo Hills. It's not that the tribesmen didn't try to fight back, they did. With their traditional iron traps and some ingeniously designed ones that crushed a rat with a log of wood or simply garroted it when it came to eat the bait. They even tried to poison the rats with zinc phosphide and used long bamboo tubes to blow tobacco smoke into the burrows, hoping that it would kill the rats nesting inside. But what could they do against an army that gave birth to new soldiers every day? Eventually, overwhelmed, entire villages were abandoned. People fleeing on foot to the towns where they hoped the government would take care of them. Now we know what happened to that. The government didn't take care of them. And this is where your book gets really heart-wrenching. Do you want to read the passage about, or do you want to do it a little later?
A little later, maybe.
Okay, so let's talk about this aspect of what really surprised me. I've known Nikhil a very long time. He's a lot of things, but one of the things he isn't is violent. He's a very gentle soul. But the violence in this book is very visual. Where does this violence come from, Nikhil?
I think it comes from the plot. It comes from where the story is set, and the fact that Mizoram went through this really brutal 20-year insurgency in which thousands of people were killed on both sides, and there was terrible suffering, right? So I think violence is intrinsic to the story I'm trying to tell. It's intrinsic to those characters who would have been impacted by that violence over 2 decades or more. And I don't think there's any other way of telling the story without, there's no way of soft peddling the violence and pretending it didn't happen. And I think that's what you're referring to. I'm not a violent person by nature. There might be some suppressed violence, under the surface that lies with every person. But I think it was important for the story and the characters, and that's what I've...
It's also a very visual story. It's visually very accessible, not just for the violence, but for the landscape and lots of other things that you create. Why didn't you write a screenplay instead?
To be honest, when I started working on this idea and developing it, I first thought of a screenplay, right? And I actually did a draft of one, but somehow the screenplay I wasn't convinced was the best medium to tell the story. Because the story has layers. It's about people, it's about suffering, it's about, of course, the Motam and the rats and the casualty and the insurgency and then the playoff between evangelism and nationalism and tribal identity. There were so many layers that I felt that a screenplay, a traditional filmic screenplay, would not do justice to the material that I had. So I took a deep breath. I've never written a novel before. It's been incredibly tough, but I decided to give it a short, and I felt that that was the best medium to tell the story I wanted to tell.
Did the fact of freedom of speech in the environment that we live in at the moment also have something to do with your choice?
Yes. I think in India there are many sacred cows. The Northeast and the army, anything to do with the armed forces, the Northeast definitely are in the top 10 list of sacred cows that we're not supposed to talk about, and not talk about negatively, especially if things haven't, worked out or gone to plan. And yes, I think even with brief conversations that I had with people whom I might have talked to about a movie or a series, dude, Northeast, Army, Armed Forces, please, hum fasna nahi chahte. So there was a lot of pushback for sure in terms of, and there is, in terms of that space. People are cautious and worried, especially in the environment, I think, of that we are in.
And there are no good guys in your book, not even the army, So there is, in fact, a passage that talks about, which I found very interesting, where, there are individual characters who are not, who are morally ambiguous, etc., all operating from personal pain or personal gain. But there is actually a passage that is very descriptive of an army situation where someone is being, whether it's, I don't know the correct words, whether in that situation they're being court-martialed or just asked to leave. And he says, off the record, you did a really good job, but on the record, I have to say that you didn't. Could you talk about this a little bit, about just A, not having the good guys, and B, just army not being what it is made out to be, especially in our creative world in India?
Okay, so there are two parts to this. I don't think there's any black and white in life, and certainly not in, in this novel that I've written. All these are shades of gray, right? There are no bad guys and there are no good guys. There's no right and there's no wrong. Everyone has their own motivation. People operate from their own sense of self-interest, and what they feel is good for them and their families and their, tribe or community. So there's definitely no bad guys in this, right?
And no good guys either.
And no good guys either, because I think people are all fundamentally flawed, all of us, right? And I've tried to inject that into the characters that I've built. They're not superheroes. They're not like the classic Bollywood, the hero who walks in and cleans it all out and sorts out the problem. They're all flawed. They're all weak. They're filled with self-doubt. They have, emotional angst that they're all carrying and baggage that they're carrying that I try to explore. So, yeah, so the first part of your question, absolutely not. No black and white, all shades of gray. On the other side is when we refer to the army, we need to, I think, be clear that, look, in the Northeast, there's the army, but there are also other paramilitary forces that are operating, right, in different regions. And these two are not the same. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff that happens locally. There are local police forces, paramilitary forces that are, operating, and not everything is perfect about the way they've operated in the Northeast over many years. And yeah, I think the novel touches upon that. I've been forced to invent a paramilitary force with a name that doesn't resonate with any existing paramilitary force.
Yes, but it's very loosely connectable, right?
Yeah, but yeah, that's the way it goes. So, yeah.
Why did you choose to write, maybe you answered this partly, military fiction, and not just a historical account of, because there is enough research, then we'll come to that. But why the genre of fiction?
The story I wanted to tell, I'm just more comfortable using fictional characters as opposed to writing, a non-fiction book about the Northeast and Mizoram specifically. I don't believe I have the knowledge and the research and the in-depth understanding that would take to write, a work of non-fiction purely on the Mizo insurgency or the Northeast. I don't want to pretend I have that knowledge either. As a storyteller, I believe the backdrop is a fantastic backdrop. It lets me explore these characters in an environment completely alien to the environment that I, or you live in and have grown up in. And I love that challenge. I love the challenge of telling that story with these characters in that backdrop.
But you say, oh, you don't have the skill to, or, maybe not the skill, but you don't have the confidence perhaps to say that I can be a voice of historian of this region. But yet, how factual are your facts, and how much research did you have to do? Because there is a lot of, dates of incidents that probably are fictionalized, but based on reality, I assume. There were things that when you read this book, that Google button is being hit all the time. That's what I was doing permanently. I was like, okay, did this really happen? Is this how it happened? Because some of it, it's quite awful, because us who don't come from the northeast are very ignorant about that part of India. Most of us couldn't even name the Seven Sisters. Is it 7-6? All that. Like, that's the point. We don't know that. So when we're reading about it, you're like, gosh, was it really like that? And so was it really like that? Talk about, because you're not born in this era.
Sure.
Was it oral research? Was it, hearing stories? Was it, talk about your research a bit.
Great question. So I started writing this book in 2020 when COVID hit us and we were all locked up in our homes. I also started writing the book because I was locked up at home with 6 very strong ladies, my mother, her secretary, a housekeeper, my wife, my daughter, and another
So you were
lady.
escaping from the women in your life.
Yeah, so I'd get up very early every morning and lock myself in a room and just hang out there for as long as I could. And when they'd bang on the door, I'd say I'm writing, right? But frankly, it took 2 weeks of being locked up before I could actually start writing, because I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to start. I've never written a novel before, to be fair. But once I got moving on it, and I actually started writing, I hit the first big roadblock, which was the research. So I had a superficial knowledge of, and an understanding. I'd done all the Google searches, etc. I knew what had happened. And I had material to start and to begin and to talk about the bigger picture. But the moment I started trying to describe characters and describe spaces and locations, and that too in the 60s, right? Not today, but right in the 60s. I mean, what did they wear? What vehicles were they driving? And it's this military fiction, space. What guns in those days? What helicopter was that guy flying? And that was excruciatingly painful and difficult, because there's very little material, especially about the Northeast, that's available. I studied, PhD theses that had been written, obscure stuff that I, got access to. It was COVID, I couldn't travel. But the big breakthrough for me, almost a year into this, where I was on the verge of giving up because I couldn't visualize this landscape, I went to the JNU library finally, in one of those breaks in COVID, and I stumbled upon a fantastic book, which is basically The Camera as a Witness to Mizoram, right? Written by two an Indian anthropology professor and someone from Germany. They had co-written this. And this was all photographs over 125 years of Mizoram and the culture, and going back to the early 20th century in evangelism. And now suddenly I could see these characters. I could see what they were dressed like in the 60s. It had a lot of stuff about the gorillas, what they wore, the clothes, It described all kinds of things about Mizoram specifically, the land that I was writing about, the food, the culture, all kinds of stuff. And then suddenly I could visualize things that I would never have been able to visualize. Frankly, I would have given up, because without this access to that research, it would have been impossible for me to continue beyond a superficial kind of limit. So that, I think, was the real breakthrough for me. And I think more visually. So these hundreds of photographs across 100 and, literally the first photographs taken in Mizoram to, when peace came in '86 with the Accord, it was all there. And then I could start writing and describing characters finally, right? In a way I could not have done without that research.
And that, when you read the book, because even things like the food from the Mizo Hills, I mean, most of us equate Northeast food with momos and not much more, right? But the way that you describe the drinks and the food and you go into description of it, I got hungry at some points in the book. Was this intentional that you wanted to paint this landscape of the Mizo Hills for its beauty so that the devastation becomes even more painful?
Yes. Also, I think food unites us. It doesn't matter where you're from. We eat Japanese food, Chinese food, whatever. It doesn't matter. There's no cultural appropriation with food, right? So I use that as part of my canvas right through the novel. One thing I've been very sensitive about, and I've tried not to do, is that I don't want to pretend that I'm from Mizoram. I've lived there, my entire life. I'm writing as an insider, with this incredible knowledge of the space, because I'm not that. I'm an outsider looking into an ecosystem, right? And I think food, for example, it doesn't matter, right? It transcends that. Food, it doesn't matter whether you're an insider or an outsider. You can describe it and you can talk about its taste and its feelings. So I've used food as a theme, as not a theme, but definitely to to paint my canvas.
It's definitely a thread that goes through.
That's right.
Now there's a village that the protagonists come from called Asaka.
Asaka, yeah.
Asaka. Now the funny thing happened is I Googled this village to go, okay, did it really exist and where was it? I just wanted to visualize it for you. Of course it didn't exist. And then I was like, okay, maybe he made it up. And then as the book goes on, and we're going to read from that part now, the village actually gets completely what they call restructured, or no, what's the word? Restructured, right? Restructured, which basically is code for demolished. And so then my brain went, oh, it did exist in the 1960s, but doesn't exist anymore on Google because the village actually doesn't exist. But as it turns out, it's a fictional place. So it's very interesting the way that he has played with reality and history and fiction. I would love you to read from that part. Be warned, guys, this is not an easy passage to digest.
Sure. But before we do that, on the subject of Asaka, so there's Asagaon in Goa, and in Mizo, Kua is village, so Asaka, right? So Asaka is a fictional place in the novel. It does not. You would not be able to Google it.
It could have easily been a real place that does not exist anymore on our Google Maps, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to read a couple of passages from chapter 5. Now the structure of the novel is, it starts with a small book of Revelations at the beginning, Lamentation at the end. These are both books that you will find in the Bible. And in the middle is divided into 4 other books, each telling a part of the story. So this is from, a section on the burning down of the destruction of Asaka. As the trucks began to fill with the villagers who had been forced into them, and the dying left to die in the courtyard, the soldiers began spreading out, lugging heavy jerry cans between them. Each hut was liberally sprinkled with petrol, even as the villagers looked on in disbelief. Then the commandant barked, "Burn it down. Burn it all down." The huts lit up instantly, their time on earth done. Like pyres at a mass cremation, each with a family watching in horror, mourning their loss. The raging flames consumed not just the structures, but the collective memories and evidence of generations past, of lives lived, an entire village razed to the ground in a flash. Then the fields were set on fire, destroying the standing crop, and the miller's hut by the stream where the grain was crushed, and the old shop in the marketplace, the grain store, and the mission homes in which Samy and Sena's families had lived, burnt. They were all burnt down. The dark smoke billowed upwards into the night sky, the only sign of the terrible tragedy that had befallen Asaka. That, and the faint and plaintive cries of men, women, and children watching the scene unfold in despair. Over the crackling of the flames, gunshots rang out, as the soldiers opened fire on villagers trying to flee into the surrounding forests. Many were gunned down, preferring death to a life without liberty. But there were others, broken and hopeless, that trudged towards the trucks that were to take them to the camp where they would be interned. There was nothing left for them in Asaka. When the village was burned down and the villagers forced into the trucks, the commandant turned his attention to the church, a silent witness to the destruction of Asaka. Burn it down.
Oof, it's really horrific. I mean, there is a lot to talk about, but I know we have to open it up to the audience. I want to ask one last question before we do. And this is about religion and Christianity. You obviously grew up in, I wouldn't say overbearing, but overwhelmingly Christian education, Christian family. But Christianity in your book doesn't always come across positively. In fact, a lot of the times it comes across as the root of a lot of problems and comes across a bit negatively. Could you tell us where your own journey with religion, what that was?
Sure. I don't think it comes across negatively. I think it comes across.
You cannot decide what the reader is thinking.
Sure, fair
Okay.
enough. Good point. But from my perspective, I think it mirrors my own journey with religion, where when we were growing up, we grew up under a very strict Christian moral framework and a code of conduct, which is very rigid, which in my teens I rebelled against. My mother is here in the audience, and she's still not very happy with my rebellion, but that's a different story. But I think I returned to my religion at a later stage in life, but not the religious structures of the church and everything else. I believe religion is for me, it's a one-on-one thing. There's no space for anyone else or the church in that relationship that I have with my God, right? And I think that is, at some level, the journey of the protagonist, right? He grows up in an evangelical family. He's taught to think a particular way. He believes certain things. And then the world turns on its head and he's forced to flee and the whole world collapses, and then he just pushes it all away and walks away from it. And it's only much later in his life when, a tragedy strikes and things that he actually returns, and at some level his spiritual journey is complete, right? So that's the way I see it. It's the protagonist and his confusion with religion and his spiritual journey.
You took 4 years to write this book. I will open it up. But is there something you discovered about yourself, Nikhil, that because, as writers, we spend a lot of solitary time in our own heads. Is there something you discovered about yourself that surprised you?
Yeah, lots. I think it took 4 years, one, because of sheer incompetence, okay? A first-time writer trying to understand how to craft a novel in the middle of Koël was quite challenging. I also think that the first 3 years went in pretending to be who I was not, in terms of trying to create a voice that, would impress the world, writing in a voice that didn't sound like mine with the benefit of hindsight, right? And there were many drafts, and then sharing those drafts with great excitement with friends and family, and and waiting for the shabash, fantastic, it's incredible. And frankly, most people never read it, or never got back with feedback. My mother was the only one who, every draft she'd read and always tell me it was fantastic and great. My wife never read it for 4 years. My kids, I kept trying to get them to read it. They never read it for 4 years. My elder brother, I kept chasing him for feedback. He never read it either. But so it was tough. So in about 3 years into this, when I reread stuff that I'd written and I'd kind of given up, I felt it was really pretentious. It was fake. It didn't sound like me at all. And then I started the process of just rethinking and restructuring it. I got lucky because I found a really good agent in Kanishka, who was here somewhere in the audience, who really loved the idea and the thought, and he helped me restructure. It was very linear earlier. We've now moved back and forth in time. And then there was Rashmi at HarperCollins, who's also here, who I had a fantastic relationship with. And together we hammered out what was actually, it was a great idea. It just needed honesty and people from the outside who had the time to look at it and say, okay, look, this is what we can do and this is how we can change it. So now I feel this is an honest piece of work. This is my world. I like every line over here. And it's not pretending to be what it's not. It's not a work of great literary fiction, right? But it's a great space, it's interesting characters, and I've just enjoyed the process of writing it.
Isn't it fabulous how, as writers, we literally have to strip away all our editing and censoring that we do and just become naked? Anyway, yes, please, can she have a mic? But please keep your questions to questions. We don't want huge comments here.
Good afternoon, Nikhil sir and Koël ma'am. My question is that, what is, according to you, what is patriotism in present scenario? And do you think that your book gives a platform, emotional platform, or gives new dimensions towards nationalism, especially for the natives of the northeast northeast part of the India?
Okay, great question, but I'm going to have to spend a little time on that. So I believe there's a difference between patriotism and nationalism, right? A nationalist believes his country is right no matter what. My country is great, fantastic. If I go to a cricket match and like India is losing, I will not cheer for the other team that's winning because, hey, I'm a nationalist. A patriot, on the other hand, loves his country, is willing to give up his life or her life for the country, but is not afraid to call out the problems or what is not working or what is wrong in the country because they love that country and they want it to, to improve, right? So in my novel, these are patriots. Whether you are the MNF or a guerrilla, right, fighting for your right of self-determination, or you're a soldier fighting to defend your country, right, and giving up your life in the course of that. These are all patriots. So my story is about patriots. It's not about nationalists.
Great question, great answer. Next.
Hi, Nikhil. As somebody from the Northeast, I must compliment you for your book. It must be the most important book that documents something as important as Mautwam that changed the life of Mizos forever. And I also appreciate the fact that you once again emphasize the fact that you are not writing from an insider's view, which makes it even more tempting for me to read. I just want to ask you something. You said the Northeasterns hold a lot of anger and emotional angst. Where do you think that comes from? And do you think even after 75 years of independence, that hasn't changed? Thank you.
I think there's definitely a lot of angst and anger in the Northeast because people feel they've been taken for granted. I think after independence, we had this massive state of Assam that got created, which subsumed a lot of identities into one big state without, giving them space to actually, from a cultural, political perspective, without allowing that voice, right, to emerge. And I think a lot of the trouble and conflict starts from there. To be fair, at independence, India had a lot of problems. There was a lot going on in the country, and people just forgot about the Northeast at some level, and Assam. Till the troubles and till they picked up the gun and the insurgencies of the 60s and then into the 70s and 80s, where it actually drew the attention of the central government and all of us and the media to what was going on. And then the creation of the new states, whether it was Manipur or Mizoram or Meghalaya or Nagaland, etc., that came out through that process. So I think, to answer your question, the angst is because people feel neglected, they feel their voice is not heard, they're being taken for granted and exploited, right? And there comes a point in time where they get up and they want to be heard. And how they attract attention, it takes many different forms. In the case of the Northeast, it was a lot of insurgencies in different parts of the Northeast that started.
Anyone else? If not, then I will take the privilege of asking you more questions. Out of all the characters, who is it? I know as a writer, we all infuse a lot of the people we know and facets of our own personality into our characters, into the world that we create. But out of all of them, who do you relate most to and why?
Yeah, I think every character at some level has something of you and your experience and your life. When you start writing, right, it's got to be, you've written a novel yourself, and you know, there are bits of you, right? But it would be crazy to tell an audience what that was, because that would be like standing naked in front of everyone saying, hey, you know, these parts are up for my life. So I'm not going to do that. But I can tell you, for example, Samy, right, the protagonist, he's born April 14th, 1942. That's my mother's birthday, April 14th, 1942. Right, so her life and her spikes and when she grew up and things would run roughly parallel to that character. Samy and Sena, their relationship. Sena is 4 years older than Samy. That's like me and my elder brother Niret. Right, he's 4 years older than I am, and when in our childhood he was like my protector and the leader of the pack of the gang of friends that we had, an unquestioned boss, right? And so that's from childhood. Mata, who's the love interest of my protagonist, she's a year older than Samy. That's like my wife and I was a year older than I am. She's saying no,
Like,
but
what
that's
are you
fine.
talking about? She's 10 years
Yes,
younger than
indeed,
you.
indeed. But yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that actually comes in from your own, experiences. But obviously, like, Che, for example, my brother is not a guerrilla commander who's murdered a lot of people in the Northeast, to be fair. So they're the elements that you use to create these characters, but then they have a life of their own, and they have a journey of their own, which has nothing to do with reality or with real people that you.
I loved that your characters, as we talked about earlier, were so flawed, and they're displaying all their flaws. They are morally ambiguous till they choose to take a stand or the other for whatever reasons, right? And you have to read the book to understand that. There's one character trait of Samy. Every time he's faced with any kind of danger, from when he was a child to when he is a grown-up, he pees his pants. May I ask where that comes from? And have you ever?
Look, I went to a boys' school, Irish Christian Brothers school, where they would whip us to the point where every man, every boy, no matter how big or small, would eventually pee or like be howling or, So yeah, there's some elements of that in the novel. But no, it's just part of his character. When in really intense, life-threatening kind of situations, it's a reflex kind of. He has no control over it. He's not a coward. He's not a, he's not like. But that's just who he is. It just makes him more real. It makes him more human, right? He's an army officer who, when caught in this crazy situation, right, he's not thinking about it, right? It's just a reflex action that happens. So it's actually to. For us to look at this character as someone who's frail, who's all sorts of different things.
Humanize him more, and actually, it's a greater connect when everyone is not so heroic.
That's
I really love that. You talked about Martha or Priya. There are not many female characters in your books for obvious reasons, because it is a military fiction, and we're still not there. As far as women in the army and the armed forces are. Who helped? Was it challenging to write from a woman's perspective? Because you are a boy's boy. Who helped you with the romantic scenes and...
Really? Well, no, you do.
No, I don't mean in real life.
No,
I mean in the
what I mean
writing.
is,
Where did you come from?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I can't write from a woman's perspective. It's challenging. Which is why perhaps the female characters in the novel are not as well developed as the male character. That is my flaw as a writer, right? To be able to put myself into that situation and write. And I can't pretend that I can do that.
It's a flaw of a lot of male writers. It's true. The women write better about men than men write about women.
That's right. So that's definitely challenging. And I think you're absolutely right. The female characters are not as well etched out in the novel as the male characters are, and that's the flaw of the writer. That's the weakness of the writer.
See, that's the flaw of the characters and the writer. I love that. It humanizes everything. There was a hand that went up there that I saw. Did someone want to ask a question? There, Chandni.
There's also Jen.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Nikhil, Koël talked about how, as a reader, she felt you had critiqued religion. I actually want to ask you, there's another very important part of your life, which is you grew up in a political world. But when I read, and I've only read half of it actually so far, I feel that you have actually also taken a very critical look at what was happening politically vis-a-vis the Northeast. Also, personally considering that you did grow up as part of that system in certain ways. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I don't think I've taken a critical look. I think I've taken a look at reality, right? I find it ridiculous that we bombed Aizwal, for example, in '66 and razed it to the ground to get the insurgents out. We wouldn't have done that, come on, in any other part of India, to be fair. Okay, and that is something that we can't pretend never happened. We did. For many years, we pretended it never happened. It wasn't in any recorded history or anything till people started speaking about it. So it's not about which government and who and what political, what your political ideology is. All that be damned. There's right at some level and there is wrong. So what we did over there was, I think, for me personally, I think was wrong, right? And I allude to that in the novel and the destruction that takes place in the lives, innocent lives that are lost. And it's not just it's not just the bombing of Aizwal. There are other elements of it. It was how the famine that resulted as a result, that came out of the plague of rats, the famine, and how badly it was handled. Right? Everyone knew that famine would come because it happens every 48 years. People wrote it off as tribal superstition. It won't happen again, but it did, and thousands of people died. So there are aspects of things that have taken place in that area, specifically Mizoram, over 20, 30 years, that I write about, but there's no political ideology or political lens to it. I don't give a damn which government was in power, and it's irrelevant. It's wrong, that's all.
I think that is the seed of your book, right? Yeah. The injustice of it all, that why wasn't something done, or why was something done which wasn't beneficial? Yeah. That is, once you read the book, it is the seed of the book. We have time for one last question. There's a gentleman at the back there. Maybe if we're quick, we can do it 2 in. We have a minute and 1 second left now.
Yeah, so my question is that when you start writing the book, there is a story in place or there is a theme, but then once you start writing, there will be subplots, and you get into that and then you think it might not make sense. So how do you deal with that? And another thing, that if I have to be a soldier, that is title of your book. Was that your first choice? If not, what were the others?
Great question. My first choice, before I started writing, I knew the title of the book. It was called The Wailing of the Bamboo. And I loved that title, and I held it very close till my editor convinced me that, look, this is not a very good idea, given that it's about military fiction. People might confuse it for a gardening book. So I had to let that go. It was painful for me personally, because I loved that title, but I had to let it go. Because I think she was right, and I believe now when I see the artwork and the design and the audience, yes, I think she was right, and I'm glad I gave that up. On your subject of subplots and things, yes, absolutely. As you write, and as the characters evolve, there are all kinds of, I've let go of at least 10 or 15 characters that I wrote. I spent a lot of time developing and writing, but then I felt were just distractions, were just, not doing anything for my plot or for the interplay, and I just got rid of them, right? So you're absolutely right. It's a process. But the process, I think, is letting go of ego, and you might have worked really hard on a particular aspect of your writing, but to be able to, throw it into the dustbin and say, look, it's not doing anything for my story.
Thank you. We could go on and on, but that's a mark of a good session. We are out of time. So I don't know how we end this. What do? We say thank you and we... Okay.